Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Using IoT Sensors and Digital Facilities Management to Maximize Building Health. We're excited to have two speakers well-versed in sensor technologies to talk about the shifting focus to indoor air quality and how to collect the right data to ensure a safe, productive environment for tenants as we all plan to re-enter commercial buildings. Just a few housekeeping items first. I will host a live Q&A at the end of the session, so please submit any questions using the Zoom Q&A feature down below. We'll also send the recording out to everyone afterwards, so please feel free to share with all your teams. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rachel Kennedy from Switch and Alex Bichakowski from Insight to kick things off. Rachel?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Kennedy, and I'm excited to be joining you today to talk about some of the things I've learned about IoT sensors as well as strategic master planning. Alex?
Thanks, Rachel. My name is Alex Bichakowski. I'm a director at Insight. My focus is on consulting business owners on using data to optimize their building operations. My background is in HVAC design, so historically, largely been focused on energy efficiency, but now we're seeing a large shift towards indoor air quality and kind of building reentry. So we've been focused on that a lot. And over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, so we're all facing this big question right now about how to safely return to commercial office buildings. We've really narrowed it down to two things. The first is following the best practices set forth by ASHRAE and the CDC. But the second is really making sure that people feel safe returning to the office. You want to make sure that you're openly communicating your data in an easy and digestible way in order for them to make the decision that's best for them.
Yeah, so like Rachel said, it's the guidelines. They're going to tell us to really focus on indoor air quality and occupancy. So with that in mind, one thing that I've found is that as of yet, there's no super strict requirements or really any enforcement of a lot of these guidelines. So, to give you an example, office buildings won't have the same mandates like you might see in hospitals. So a lot of the guidance comes from what we're doing in healthcare. But for example, a hospital will have a code that says an operating room, for example, has to maintain 40 to 60% humidity in the space, and that can be enforced by an organization called Joint Commission. And that's something similar that we're saying now in office buildings, but CDC guidelines say that you should try to maintain that humidity, and there's no real enforcement mechanism there. So, it's really up to the building owners and operators to then take the guidelines, see how that fits into their operations and determine best practices specifically for their buildings. So really the guidelines are kind of a starting point, and we go from there. So if we talk about indoor air quality, obviously we want to know exactly what do we want to measure and how do we meet that. So in buildings, we previously were concerned about a lot of the same things, maybe focus more on tenant comfort and energy efficiency, but we have a lot of this data already in our buildings. So to give you an example of some of those, every building is going to have some sort of data behind space temperature. You could have information on space humidity. Buildings get ventilated, so you might have a building automation system that will tell you about airflows, air changes. That's going to be the ventilation piece. As we dig a little deeper, some buildings have CO2 monitoring, volatile organic compounds, and then you may even have some information specifically on your filtration. So beyond just MERV ratings, but particulate matter, so you can actually count the particles that are in the air. Some buildings may have that already. That may be something that you're looking at adding. And then beyond that, occupancy. We already have some kind of sense of occupancy in buildings that we're going to use going forward when we focus on indoor air quality. So we're taking these guidelines, we're comparing it to our data that we have and determine whether our indoor air quality is good. If it's not good, if it's bad, then we need to take some measures, do things like increasing ventilation, filtration, humidity. So that's kind of, we know that's kind of where we're starting. But before we consume, all this data, we need to kind of develop a strategy first.
So as Alex mentioned, that strategy is a fundamental first step. Right now, our strategies are focused on best practices to mitigate the spread of COVID. whether that's meeting indoor air quality and ventilation best practices or limiting the number of people and the density to reduce the capacity to allow for social distancing. But that strategy is focused on today. What about tomorrow? The CDC is constantly working to find best practices and continually publish reports and findings. So you want to make sure that you're choosing a solution that allows you to adapt as those needs adapt. You don't want to focus on siloed systems, but how you can bring all of these systems together to use them effectively. The key is first setting up that infrastructure to use a data-driven process. Start with what you already have, as Alex mentioned. A lot of the building management systems already have data, including temperature, relative humidity, or CO2. Bring that out so that you can leverage it in the right way. And then figure out what else you're trying to measure. Be strategic about what you're using, and then supplement it with what you don't have. Ultimately, you want to determine what you are trying to achieve and how you're measuring it. And then you want to develop a way to visualize it so you can effectively use it to action it and be informative in real time.
So Rachel mentioned, this data-driven process. So that's really what we want to switch to. Being data-driven doesn't mean going out and buying every sensor on the market. We really want to be strategic about what data is important and what we want to show. So being data-driven means doing things because that's what the data says, not necessarily because that's the way you've always been doing things. In order to act on the data, we have to see it. So visualization really is key. If you can see it, if you have it all in one place, you can digest it and act on it there. So, and that's obviously with building operators. If you're actually operating the building, making changes, you want to see the data. But the other piece that Rachel mentioned earlier about making your tenants safe and making them feel comfortable, that data and visualization can also do that. So if you can show your building tenants, people entering your building, if that the space is safe, that you're meeting these guidelines, that's going to make them feel more comfortable. That's going to let them do what they want to do, whether it's if they're in your building shopping or whether they're working. They're going to be able to focus on that and not be worried that they might get sick. Then with being a data-driven process, the big advantage of that is that you're now flexible. So right now is a time that you should be running your building differently. So whereas before, we were worried largely on, let's say, energy efficiency, we still care about that, but right now that focus has shifted to indoor air quality, certainly more than it was, maybe about 6 months ago.
Alex, I wanted to stop you and ask a question there. A lot of clients are dealing with the challenge of balancing that energy efficiency requirements with the IAQ recommendations. Can you give us some examples of how you're balancing those two goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so that's still there. We still want to be, saving energy, and certainly when our buildings are largely shut down before reentry, we don't want to be wasting energy, running the building at full speed, just to ventilate for the sake of it. So right now, maybe we're a little more focused on energy efficiency. As we open back up and people actually start to enter the building, that's when it's going to shift a little bit towards indoor air quality. So a very specific thing, a measure that you can take. Let's say you do have CO2 sensors in your building, and you can monitor CO2, which is going to give you a sense of how many people are in the air, how much they're breathing in the air, releasing carbon dioxide. That's a metric that a lot of buildings will have. So before, we use CO2 for tenant comfort, and we may measure CO2 and say that 1,000 ppm, parts per million, is appropriate for tenant comfort. Well, we're maybe worried about building health. So a metric that I'm seeing that shift to is about 700 parts per million. So if we take CO2 levels lower, that's going to make the building try to ventilate a little bit more. So at times you may use a little more energy to do that when it's really hot outside. But that's where we're kind of shifting, we're shifting priorities. So we're shifting kind of our goals to get to, 700 parts per million. So the outcomes there may be different, but again, that data-driven process where you're using the data, to get to a certain outcome, that's still the same. All right, so we know what we can measure. What should we measure? So there's a lot, like we said, we can measure. So we talk about temperature, humidity, CO2, even particulate matter. But short of measuring everything there is, we want to be specific. So Occupancy is another thing we can look at. Occupancy is important. Some of the guidelines say, you need to leave occupancy at a certain level. Occupancy also, will tell you when you need to worry about indoor air quality, because if it's not occupied, it's, indoor air quality is less of an issue. Occupancy can even kind of be used as a proxy for some of the other metrics you may or may not have, such as CO2, that kind of thing. So the first thing I would say about what you should measure is measure the data you have. So take stock of what you do have, use that first, and then develop a strategy of thinking what you can add, what specific sensors you might want to add to kind of see that full picture of indoor air quality, if you can't meet it with what you already have. So that's a strategic process. And Rachel has actually some good information about, what those different options are.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so I think as Alex is saying, you want to really leverage the data you already have. But when you're looking to add other data or increase that, you kind of want to think about granularity, especially for occupancy, in a couple different metrics. So this was published by a research paper, and it talks about resolution in 3 different categories. The first is spatial resolution. This helps us think about occupancy. Do you need to know at a building level, or do you need to know the exact coordinates where someone is located? A great example of this that we're seeing today right now with COVID is for janitorial cleaning. We just simply need to know that the space was occupied in a conference room so we can notify the janitorial staff to do a deep cleaning of that space. Other instances that we're seeing commonly right now is about contact tracing. We want to know exactly where someone was in the space, who they might have had interactions with, and who that person was. And that brings us to that second category of resolution, occupant resolution. This is if we're trying to figure out whether simply there is occupancy presence. For example, in a lighting control system, when we want to turn on the lights, we want to know if someone's there. But when we're talking about that contact tracing, this is when we want to know who that person is, and tying that with that spatial resolution. And the final is a temporal resolution. This is about the frequency at which you're collecting your data. Is it enough to know that you're doing it on a daily basis, or are you looking down to the exact second of where someone was traveling? The couple examples that we're seeing prominent today for the temporal resolution are for air flushes. Is it enough to know that that was done throughout the day? Or are we trying to portray to our clients or our tenants that the indoor air quality is healthy at that moment, in which case we want to capture more real-time data. All of these different categories can help us determine what the right sensor technology is based on the strategy and the questions we're trying to answer. So talking about the different types of sensors that are out there, there's so many different ones, it's often hard to narrow it down to 1 or 2. But if we can think about it in those categories based on strategies, we can start to pick the right technology for our needs. The first one is leveraging what you already have. Do you have a lighting control system? In which case you could use your PIR sensor to capture occupancy in that space. Do you have an access control system? This can help figure out who's entered your building over the day. But the question is, are these granular enough for what you're trying to do? Right now with COVID, we want to capture really granular, high density data, in which case multi-sensors can help supplement what you already have. These are great because there are multiple data points within one piece of hardware. You can capture relative humidity, temperature, occupancy, light levels, all in one sensor. They can be retrofitted into your existing infrastructure if you have a lighting control system, or they can be added as a standalone. What if you're the tenant in your space and you're trying to capture this information? This is when you can look at other IoT sensors that use protocols like LoRa or communicate wirelessly. These help capture those same data points without having access to that base building system that you don't have as a tenant. You can bring all of these into a cloud platform using a gateway on the site without having to install extensive infrastructure. Other use cases that we're seeing commonly for open areas or shared spaces are whether there's a high density of people trying to board the elevator while we're waiting for limited capacity. In addition, for retail spaces, how many people are dwelling right outside your store? These are often large areas with large number of people, and you want to use them to capture a large area. That's when you can look at Bluetooth beacons or Wi-Fi beacons. The one thing you want to keep in mind, though, is that these often vary on accuracy based on the number of active users, making sure that people have their Wi-Fi or Bluetooth turned on. When you're really looking for that accurate count of people in your space, if you have a capacity limit or you can only allow a certain number of people, that's when you'd want to look at cameras that are very good at getting accurate counts of numbers of people. Two common ones. One is blob technology that can be installed on top of some of your existing security cameras. Another is a camera that can be located above your doors, which counts the number of people coming in and leaving based on the crossing of a plane. This is supplementary to an access control system where oftentimes tap out's not required, so you can't get an accurate count of people in your space. And then finally, air quality sensors. Like we said, some of these already exist in the building management system. But when you don't have that, you can install monitors that are separate that can show that data right there for you. With so many different sensors technologies out there, it's important to choose the right ones based on your strategy. But at the same time, it's also good to think about how you can use these sensors with each other. For example, if you have an access control system already, you can find out who's entering the building. If you then locate desk sensors when you have assigned desk seating, you can make sure that those desks are occupied to allow the right social distancing if you have an A or B team. Bringing these two technologies together can give you that more granular information you're looking for without installing a completely separate system. Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about what Sensors Insight is looking into?
Yeah, definitely. So we're constantly looking at different products on the market and seeing, you know, what kind of end uses that we can get out of that. So I'll give an interesting example of something we're working on right now, where we want to validate cleanings in our space. So we want to make sure that our space is getting a deep clean every night. So there's a lot of different data that you can look at to do that, and we're kind of testing them all at once. So we have these sensors that kind of are all in one. One company makes a product that looks at temperature, humidity, CO2, and even VOC levels. So when you do a deep clean, you're going to have some of these volatile organic compounds come off, and you can actually sense that. So that's a sensor that can potentially validate, if you've got that data trended, you can validate the cleaning with that VOC spike. And at the same way, the building also has security access required. So if you want to tap in, tap out, you can access that data and see, hey, did the person that has the key card from the janitorial staff, did they key in, key out? Did they key in, key out all the days they were supposed to be there? So testing that. And then we can also confirm that people entered the space. If you've got some of these doorway threshold sensors so that you can see every time someone comes in or comes out of the space and do occupancy that way, you can measure, you can kind of keep that, validate that way to see that they actually enter the space. Maybe they didn't just key card in. So the combination of all that data, put that all in one place, you know, that can provide a solution where, hey, now you're validating cleanings, that sort of thing. So that's just an example of what we do. But from a larger, you know, point of view, we can do a lot of stuff with different data. But the key is, again, once you have it, you want to you measure it, you want to visualize it, and then once it's visualized, then you can act on it. So create a dashboard for whatever end use you can think of, really. So, or whatever's important to you. So in one case, you may have a building operator. So you want to have a space where your building operator can look at all these different data points, the temperatures, the humidities. Those are good. That's great. Maybe CO2 is too high. Okay, now he knows maybe he needs to ventilate a little bit more. You know, what's the weather looking like this afternoon? That can help him, you know, predict what he's going to have to do with his HVAC system, you know, later in the day. You know, what is your occupancy counts, that kind of thing. So that's one end use. You know, you can create a dashboard. Then again, we talked about making people feel comfortable. If you've got a place where you can broadcast some of your high-level metrics at your building to make sure your occupancy counts are where they need to be, or whether it's, you know, your particulate matter is low enough where it should be, or you know, temperatures, humidity, CO2s are where they need to be. That's a place where, you know, if you've got tenants, if they can see that and they understand what you're striving for, then they can, you know, that can help them feel safe. Maybe they're going to make some decisions about whether to come into the office that day, work from home, those kinds of things. So again, lots of different use cases that we're using this for, but what we want to kind of really highlight to you is again that data-driven process. So that's where we feel that the data can be really powerful. And again, like we said, so this specific focus on IEQ, indoor air quality, that's gonna change the way you act. So you're gonna ventilate more, filter more, humidify more, whatever you need, whatever the data tells you need to do. Or maybe you need to change your occupancy requirements. Maybe you thought you could have 50 people in your building. Maybe after looking at the data, said, hey, we can't get CO2 where we want it to, with 50 people. So we got to limit it to 30 people if you've ever retail space, something like that. So again, using data, help it drive decisions, and in the end, in this case, to keep people safe. So with that, takeaways, our very first question is, what do we do to ensure, a safe building reentry? Follow guidelines and convey that data to your tenants to help them be informed and feel safe. So do those two things. If you remember anything from today, I'd say remember those two things. Where you, with your data, follow data-driven process, and then visualize the data. That's going to let you use it to and inform your actions.
Yeah. I'd say the other takeaways are leveraging the data you have, supplement with the right sensor technology you have, make sure you're choosing a solution that can scale as the needs change and as you learn from that data-driven process. You want to consider the flexibility in changing sensor technologies and adding new sensors as needed. Think about how easy they're to install, commission, and maintain. And finally, just coming back to that strategy. If you really want to focus on this data-driven process, make sure you're setting up for that. You want to make sure you're having open communication between the tenants, owners, and operators so that everyone can feel safe. If we're outside of the ranges, we want to quickly alert our facility managers so they can work to maintain a healthy space for all of us. So thank you for joining us today, and I will pass it on to Sarah.
Thanks, guys. So we did have a couple of Q&As come in here. Alex, you mentioned a couple of CDC and ASHRAE guidelines. Can you tell the audience where they can find those?
Yeah, definitely. So, so CDC has some really good resources. Obviously the CDC has a lot of resources beyond just buildings. But I can pull up, I'll share my screen here again and pull up kind of the link that I've been used to get some of this information that I provided today. And that will, and then we'll share the links with everyone when we send out the presentation recording. So if you bear with me here, so CDC, again, they've got a lot, cdc.gov. I found that they have good interim guidance here for businesses and employers responding to COVID-19. That's a good resource from the CDC standpoint. And then if we're talking specifically about building operations, CDC relies a lot on ASHRAE, which is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. So this is a really good source that I found, this ASHRAE.com. They're technical resources. They've got preparedness plans for COVID-19, building types by building sector. So I go through here. This is where we get a lot of the recommendations. And like I said earlier, the challenge for building operators will be that, there's a lot of language in here. A lot of it is kind of do what you can, ventilate as much as you can, if possible. So those guidance is going to be, dependent on what your building can do. So not every building can bring in 100% outside air. So you're going to be a little bit limited then with kind of what you can do, but following the guidelines, kind of doing the best you can is kind of where, what the guidelines are saying right now.
Great. And Rachel, there was a question about the title of the paper that you mentioned. I did drop that link in the Q&A or in the chat feature here. So if you guys want to click on that, you'll be taken to it. And we'll also include that in the follow-up email so you can read a little more about that. I don't know if Rachel, you had anything else to mention about the paper?
Yeah, I would just say it does a good job of kind of helping decipher some of those different occupancy types based on just the resolution that you want to look at. So if you think about it in that way, it can help you pick the right technologies from there.
Great, and so the next question here for Alex. How many CO2 sensors are you suggesting to monitor occupancy for the granularity needed for COVID mitigation in every zone?
That's about as granular as you'd want to get, is kind of per zone, so kind of per VAV box. I've also seen it kind of done per air handler, so kind of like per floor, because that's going to tell you kind of how much you can ventilate. So I would say those are kind of the most common ways we've seen it, either per zone or per air handler. You know, the more granular you are, the more control you're going to have, but obviously it's going to come at a higher cost, and that's where you know, you got to kind of make those decisions, you know, by looking at the long-term strategy.
Great, and this next one is for Rachel. How can I know what data my building already has before I begin investing in additional sensors or technologies?
Yeah, so this is a great question of figuring out what you have before you're trying to figure out what those next technologies are. So something we're doing at Switch Automation is we have a digital device discovery, or DX3, where we can figure out what's on the network already, figuring out those systems and data points before you start to begin that next step in your strategy.
Lots of questions coming in here. Sorry, to try to keep up. Let's see. So next one for Alex. What types of tenant and guest pre-screening solutions have you seen, if any?
So we have, you know, so our company at Insight, you know, we work as a property manager as well. So we've created just a questionnaire that we ask all of our vendors to use before they enter the space. So that's pretty simple. You can do it on a phone. You can do it on a, you know, on your laptop. That's one way of doing it. You can also do health checks through taking temperatures, and there's a couple ways to do that. You can, you know, just have a security guard standing there taking people's temperatures. I've seen thermal cameras take people's temperatures in some places where, you know, if you've got high traffic, you have a camera there, and you maybe have one security person monitoring the camera, and it'll kind of alert if someone has a fever. So people that are familiar with the symptoms of COVID-19 and asymptomatic spread or pre-symptomatic spread, that's not going to catch everything. So that's why you know, it's going to be kind of piecemeal, and you're doing what you can. So there's no perfect way, you know, short of testing everyone that enters your building. So unless if you have a very good access to tests, you know, you're gonna kind of be relying on maybe health checks and questionnaires, that kind of thing.
Great, and one more for Rachel here. How are building health visualizations being used for different audiences?
Yeah, so you want to think about when you're thinking about how you're visualizing this data, you want to think about it in who's seeing it. So you're going to want a tenant-facing dashboard, or one where the people who are occupying your space know that these areas are healthy. If they're within ranges, can we easily say that it's a green space for them to quickly go into? And if not, are we alerting them and allowing them to make the action to either work from home or work in a different space? But you also want to think about the operators. Are they aware if the filters need changed, or if the range is too high and they need to increase the airflow? So allowing them to have a dashboard that helps them quickly action that information so that they can start to provide the right ranges or airflow to those people. And then you want to think about one from your building owner. They're going to want to know how many people are in their building, who's tracking in and out. So making sure that they have the information that they're also looking for in an easy way to see.
Great, and let's see here. So kind of sort of related, what solutions have you seen for maintaining 6 feet of social distancing in an office environment? For Rachel, sorry.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. There's different ways of looking at it. The first is, do you want to put those density of sensors in there where they're located on a 6x6 grid? If we can detect occupancy in both of them, we can flag them. Or is it creating the capacity limits to make sure that we're not allowing more people into the space, and realizing that as occupants, they'll be able to tell whether they're close enough or too close quickly so that they can make that corrective action. And so figuring out whether technology is the right solution, or if you want to think about it in terms of bringing that with humans, that they can make those decisions correctly. Alex, I don't know if you've seen anything more on that as well.
Yeah, I think in an office environment, I think the level of granularity you need to do social distancing with, let's call it the 6-foot rule with technology is there's a lot. So that can be pretty cost prohibitive, let's call it. For different types of spaces where you maybe let's think about warehouses, that kind of thing, where you can invest a little more and you've got a very small set of people that may be using it. There are some wearable Bluetooth technologies that can that'll alert you if you're too close to someone else wearing, a similar Bluetooth style beacon. So that can exist as well. But there's some requirements where, everyone's got to wear this beacon kind of thing on there as a lanyard or something like that. So you can go there with technology. In a more typical office environment, I totally agree with you where, go for occupancy limits, and then let people, maintain their own, social distancing themselves. Low-tech solution, we've seen things like, placemats that have a 6-foot diameter around a desk. So if you approach someone's desk, that's kind of a visual indicator to, not breach that barrier, step on the mat. So I just maybe add that to your point.
Great, and this next one for Alex. Do you have any specific examples of data-informed modification to buildings operations that you have helped building operators implement, in parentheses, sequences?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? You said building separations?
Buildings operations.
Okay. I'm sorry. Just repeat.
I do the whole one.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific examples of data-informed modification to buildings operations that you've helped operators implement?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned before, talking about, CO2. So if you can measure CO2, kind of adjusting your set points on CO2, that's a good way to increase your ventilation. And if you've got it set up, you can kind of do it automatically. So you just kind of change the set point and it works from there. A big thing that we're looking at is how you're utilizing your ventilation system. So there's times where you can ventilate for free, and that's called economizer. So if you think of your house, you can open up your windows, you can cool your house that way. In buildings, it's the same thing. So we'll kind of bring in as much outside air, and we can cool the building with outside air. So so that's kind of a win-win where you can save energy and ventilate more. So so kind of tweaking your building operation system, it's kind of more of a focus on ventilation. So doing that more hours of the day, where you are ventilating. So that's, so that's maybe a specific change that we've seen as well.
And for Rachel, how can building health solutions vary from commercial office to retail environments? And what if a space does not have a BAS?
Yeah, so I think going back to some things we pointed out in the presentation is the strategy is going to vary based on your use cases. So I think when we're looking at commercial office buildings, like we were just talking about, that's where you want to make sure you're reaching those capacity limits, but then allowing people to make those right decisions about the social distancing. You tend to know people in your office, so you can decide and communicate openly. Where when you're thinking about retail environments, oftentimes you don't know the people that are coming into that space as well. And so the onus is more on the retail owner to make sure that they're meeting those spaces appropriately. So this is where you're going to want to look at where people are moving in your space and making sure you're allowing enough room for the people to move freely and openly. So you can often see in grocery stores, there's one-way aisles to make sure that the flow of traffic is appropriate. You can also look at more anonymous technologies. So putting a camera at the entrance to count the number of people are coming in, but not necessarily knowing who it is, since you don't have access control and you don't really want to limit based on who is coming into your store. So thinking about those different ways of looking at it based on whether you know who it is or whether it's people who aren't always returning or returning on less frequency. And then for that second part of the question about the building management system, so oftentimes either as tenants, you don't have access to that base building system. So this is when you want to look at other sensors that can be installed separate of that can capture that same information. So when we were talking about some of those IoT sensors, they're often wireless, can be installed easily, and then they have just a gateway or way of communicating without having to run data and power to all of the sensors, which is pretty invasive if you're only a tenant. And so you can capture the same granularity without relying on those sensors that you might already see. And same with IAQ monitors. This is where you can get all of that data for relative humidity, temperature, TVOC, PM 2.5, PM 10, all in one piece of hardware, where you're not going to have those sensors already installed, so you're getting the most bang for your buck there.
Lots of good questions coming in here. Going to keep going here. So Alex, have you seen access to a property being restricted by an access control system based on a health survey being completed or not?
So we like I mentioned before, we've done that. We have a health survey that we require that. So that can be, we've kind of got that set up. We haven't used it yet, but that setup is there. So if someone, fails a health survey, you can restrict access. That would be, the way we have it set up is it's still a bit of a manual process where, a person would have to read the survey, say it's, it hasn't passed, and then restrict access. I'm not sure if you could restrict access. You can, you'd probably want to communicate with them why they're restricted. So I haven't seen it actually happen to someone yet, if that's a question, but yeah, we've got like a similar process to that set up.
Great, and Rachel, we have a couple around occupancy information. So first one is, how valuable is heat mapping occupancy traffic patterns in your COVID tech solutions, and what can you do with that info? And also, how can you use occupancy information to use to determine the conditioning of a floor or tenant space?
Okay, so I'm going to answer those one at a time. The first one is around heat mapping. So I think with heat mapping, it doesn't happen in real time. So that's something that you need to be thought of. It's usually just the aggregation of data over a specified time period. So whether that's a day or a week. So when you're thinking about that, heat mapping tends to be useful for understanding traffic patterns in your spaces, so you can adjust as necessary, or sometimes with janitorial cleaning, if you're knowing that or facilities maintenance, if you know that an area is being used more, can you set more frequency of scheduling? So in that case, heat mapping is more of a way of looking at the data afterwards and changing your processes going forward rather than adjusting to it in real time. And then can you ask those next few questions again?
Yep, sure. So the next one is, how can occupancy information be used to determine the conditioning of a floor or tenant space?
So I guess I'll answer this a little differently. So when we think about how we're ventilating our spaces, we want to focus on the spaces where the people are occupied. And so that's where indoor air quality and occupancy together really provide the most value, is making sure that you're focusing your resources on where the people are. So if we know an entire floor is empty, are we bringing extra air or to the floor where people are located? And so when you're bringing those together, it's where you can really focus on a specific area.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. So that's where we've seen, yeah, definitely occupancy. If you're thinking about, hey, you only want to ventilate when it's occupied, you use occupancy sensors for that. CO2 is also a really good sensor for that. The CO2 levels will kind of tell you how many people are in the space, proxy for that, and let you ventilate that way. So I would just add that. And then interesting point, Rachel, about heat mapping. I've kind of seen it as well, and I think the question was, we've kind of seen heat mapping, how it's used. So I'll ask a question. What data sources have you seen that you can produce a heat map from? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. So I think how heat maps are typically produced, or I've seen before, is it's tracking the frequency of, so you'll have a couple different occupancy sensors installed, usually at high granularity, and you'll see that one triggers and quickly later a second occupancy sensor triggers. So it shows or portrays the motion of people through that area or through that space. And so that's a way of tracking some of those motion trails. But also another way that heat maps are used are over a certain amount of time, if we're seeing that that area is high occupancies, such as a common area or a lunch break room, that's where we would want to see that maybe we're putting extra precautions in there and really putting up signage or visual display to make sure you're keeping your social distancing, because we know that more people, or that's a higher occupancy space, maybe than a private office where we typically know that only one person is going to be in there.
Okay, so it would be so you need high density occupancy sensors to be able to produce a heat map.
Yeah, because it's that granularity of data that really allows you to get that information visually.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Great, just a few more here. So Rachel, how can ongoing commissioning and retrocommissioning help as buildings become more utilized for reentry? And what are the benefits of that?
I'm actually going to send that question over to you, Alex, if you don't mind.
Yeah, definitely. So retrocommissioning, ongoing commissioning, I look at that as validating the things that that the building's supposed to do. So if you're when you first construct a building and first occupy it, you've got someone that goes around and checks the dampers, make sure the dampers are opening to where they're supposed to. You kind of test and balance the airflow to make sure you're bringing in a certain amount of outside air. And then, not all buildings are going to have, all these sensors that we talked about that are constantly measuring the exact airflow of your outside air and everywhere in there. So, and those things tend to drift over time. So, dampers come out of calibration, temperature sensors come out of calibration. What retrocommissioning and ongoing commissioning will do is kind of this constant validation that the way your building was when it was set up perfectly and it drifted from that, you're kind of constantly bringing that back. So you may think you're ventilating your building, because someone opened up a damper when they first installed the damper, but it may close or something like that. So the retrocommissioning, ongoing commissioning is kind of a continuous way of fixing those things that over time tend to degrade in quality.
Great, and Rachel, there's a question around if you do find that you need to purchase more sensors, will these be linked to the BMS?
So you can do it a couple of different ways, depending on how your systems are and what sensor technologies you're looking at. So I think first is figuring out what is the best sensor you need and which ones are there. And then the next is figuring out that installation path as well as that data transfer path. So are you going to go through the BMS? Are you connected to the BMS where we can have that information? Or is that data being pushed to a third-party cloud, in which case you'd want to pull it back down into whatever system you want to use to visualize it? And so looking at the sensor technology and figuring out those different options, it will all vary just based on the use case.
Great, one more for you here, Rachel. What types of detection technologies can be used for occupancy sensors, and what are the pluses and minuses?
Yeah, so Alex, I don't know if you want to go back to that slide where we were showing all the different types. So there's so many different types, and I think you kind of think about them in the right case based on your use cases. So I can talk through some of those pluses and minuses. So with the PIR sensors and the access control system, as I said, some of these are already existing, but they often tend to be at lower granularity. So if we're thinking about those different resolutions, we're looking at some of the more one per space or one per building. So you don't have that high density that you would need for a heat map, let's say. When we think about some of those different multi-sensors, again, a lot of the pros are that they have multiple different data points within one sensor, but they often require a retrofit, or you're going to want to be installing them separate. So it does allow that flexibility of not necessarily needing some infrastructure underneath, because they can communicate in wirelessly or running power and data directly to that sensor. But that does provide the bonus of the high granularity. You're not requiring active users, or in the cases of Bluetooth beacons and Wi-Fi, that people have those turned on. We're going to capture those measurements of the people for occupancy in both cases. If we're looking at those IoT sensors, I categorize them I think the big advantage is if you don't have access to that base building system, or you're just looking to completely supplement it in a different way. So these protocols communicate quickly, low battery drainage. They're often easier to install, and they allow you to capture that granularity of data based on your specific needs. So the difference between these IoT sensors and multi-sensors that I tend to see or define is that IoT sensors usually will capture one data point, but multiple little sensors will bring that full value, where the multi-sensors are bringing them all in one. And so kind of a little bit of a difference there. I think some of the pros with desk sensors, if you're really looking for that granularity of who's in that desk or who's sitting there, those can really help with that. But oftentimes some of your overhead occupancy sensors will capture that information, and it can become redundant. With Bluetooth beacons and Wi-Fi, these are great over large areas of spaces. They really allow you to capture a large range with a few beacons, but they do have varying accuracy. Like I said, it's dependent on how active these people are. If they're turning off their phone, you can't really count them accurately. And the other key is that sometimes Bluetooth can put a drain on batteries, so you always want to look out for that, because if people aren't willing to use the technology, it doesn't really help having it installed. I think with cameras, the big con we tend to see is the fear of Big Brother, or is there challenges with facial recognition. And so making sure that people are comfortable with the camera, but they tend to provide the most accuracy. Other challenges could be line of sight. So if you're using that blob technology to figure out the number of people, if the camera is blocked or limited view, you're not really going to be able to see that accurately. But the people counting with cameras of people entering and exiting, those tend to be fairly accurate, but again, you're going to have to install one per door to get an accurate count. So I think that answered your question, unless you have any others.
Yeah, we have just a few more here. There's a pretty technical question here on for Rachel. Did you integrate these occupancy detecting results into the control loop? For example, if high occupancy is detected, the control system will increase the supply air fan speed.
Yeah, so a lot of the occupancy sensors that I've installed right now has been around focusing on getting counts and that capacity limits. Alex, do you have any specific use cases where you guys use that information?
Yeah. If you have, if that's so this would be a scenario where you do have a building automation system. You've got a high level of data already there on your building automation system, and you add that data point of occupancy, then you can do that. So I think, so the question is, what is your occupancy data point? I mean, from scheduling is something that you do all the time on the building automation system, and all scheduling is you look at a calendar and say, hey, turn on or off these hours. We've done integrations with access, conference scheduling systems. So you might have one scheduling system that's totally separate from the BAS, but you kind of integrate that with your BAS. So instead of just saying run from 9 to 5 every day, it's only run when the building operation, when the conference scheduling system says there's going to be someone in there. So we've done those integrations, and then what we're working on now is working with some of these occupancy counter type solutions. So these doorway camera counters, security systems, where you can see when someone enters the building. Let's say someone enters the building on a Saturday, where you might not normally be running. Well, if a certain person does enter on a Saturday, maybe you want to turn on the HVAC. That's something that we're actively working on. But yes, it can be done.
Great, and for Rachel, are there any opportunities for utility rebates to offset these new system costs?
That's a great question. There's none that I know off of the top of my head, but maybe we can put a response to that if we know more.
I can jump in on that as well. I haven't seen anything specific for occupancy kind of solutions. What we do see a lot is this sort of pay for performance style rebate, and we've seen these kind of all over the country. So what would happen is you basically submit a custom rebate application to utility and say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and this is going to save, you know, $1,000 a month, whatever it may be. And a lot of these utility companies, they'll have their own engineers on staff that can then review your custom application, review your calculations, maybe require some sort of validation with other sensors. And then once that's validated, you can get that rebate through kind of a custom path. It can be a lot of work. You can imagine trying to, you know, write up a technical document describing what you're doing, having someone review it, and then go maybe have to even add in more sensors to validate the savings. But that's the path that I would see that this potentially getting rebates at this point.
Great, and just one more for Alex here. How can CMMS data be used in building health solutions?
Yeah, good question. So CMMS, computer maintenance management systems, so work order tickets, that sort of thing. Preventative maintenance tickets are being logged in a system that's usually separate from, you know, your building automation system. And we work with that data. We kind of combine it with BAS data. So I'd say there's two things that you can get out of that. With work orders, specifically, you can look at so right now we're seeing huge reductions in occupancy throughout buildings. And as you can imagine, there's less work orders. So the number of work orders we've actually seen can kind of be used as a proxy for occupancy. So, you know, days where you have a very, very low number of work orders, that means the building's less occupied, and days where there's a lot. Historically, we look at comfort complaints as an indicator of poor air quality. So if people are complaining because it's too hot, too cold, too humid, that kind of thing, that's an indicator that you may have poor air quality. So that's another way to use CMMS. And then lastly, preventative maintenance. You'll have a lot of work order tickets to do preventative maintenance, things like filter changes, you know, checking HVAC fans, that sort of thing. The preventative maintenance logs can verify that you've done some of those cleanings, so those you know, maintenance issues that need to be done. You know, and if they're not being done, then that's a good way to kind of highlight that issue.
Great, and then just one more for you both, just to kind of wrap everything up. Can you both just say a little bit about what it takes to change to this more data-driven process?
Sure. So it's, you know, it's like we said before, it's really just having the data and having the mindset to use the data to inform your decisions. You know, so if you have, you know, however your organization's structured, if you have, you know, weekly meetings with everyone in the building, or if you're, you know, if you're a tenant and you're looking at these things, you know, really allowing, wherever your decisions are being made, allowing data to enter and make your decision process. So, you know, so if you're making decisions about how much occupancy you should have in your building, you know, using if you've got CO2 sensors in your buildings, you might have them not even know it. So, you know, ask the question and actually use the data and just kind of always be cognizant of, you know, if you're going to make a decision, make sure there's some underlying data there to support, you know, your reasoning for doing that.
Yeah, and I would just add, it doesn't change, completely end what you're already doing. It's really just helping supplement it and allow you to do it more effectively. So if you're already changing those sequences and maintaining them, this is really just bringing in that concrete way to look at it and do it more effectively than doing it one by one. So I think another big piece is now portraying that in a way that everyone can use it effectively. So your tenants now know you as an operator may more quickly know so that you can address it. And so it's bringing all of those parties together to really figure out what you're focused on and how you're achieving it. And then if you're not, how you can address it quickly so you can get there more closely.
Great, well, thank you to you both. With that, we'll wrap up the webinar, and thanks to everyone who attended. We will have a recording sent out to everyone following the webinar, so feel free to share with any of your colleagues. And coming soon, we'll have a more detailed guide on how to evaluate sensors to support your digital FM program, so stay tuned for that. We'll send to everyone who registered. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.